I went on a camping trip with my buddy from college. I'll call him Andrew to keep both of our identities private. We'd been friends for less than a year. We both enjoyed the forest and going for hikes, but really haven't ever stayed overnight in nature before. This was during spring break at our school, and we'd been planning this trip for a while. We picked a trail that we were familiar with and got a basic idea of the area we would set up at. And come the day of, we headed out without thinking twice. We were happy seeing that nobody else was on the trail. In fact, we had chosen this trail for that very reason, knowing it was never a busy attraction. The trail took us about 6 miles into the forest before we got the general area where we wanted to set up. We pitched our tent and had a small meal just before the sun was about to go down. Andrew and I collected some large sticks and stones to make a fire with and got it going just before it got dark. Irresponsibly, we bought a pack of beers and started drinking while talking, just hanging out by the fire. We had some good conversations and had fun, but a couple hours in we were ready to call it a night. We put out the fire, then got into our tents to go to bed. I fell asleep quite quickly really, maybe because of the calm sounds of nature, but throughout the night I kept waking up. It wasn't due to any noises, but I would just jerk awake for some reason. I assumed it was just me being unfamiliar with being out in the forest that night, but it still gave me an uneasy feeling. Then on maybe the 4th or 5th time waking up, I heard Andrew's tent unzipping. I thought he was probably going to use the bathroom or something, but he only took a few steps until I heard him opening up his backpack and start searching around. Another 30 seconds or so went by, with no noise. It was like he was just standing right outside of his tent. I sat up and eventually unzipped my tent and looked out. As soon as the sound of my zipper begun, I heard Andrew's footsteps rush away from the front of the tent. And by the time I stuck my head out, Andrew had ducked down and quickly shoved something back into his backpack, then turned and looked at me with a concerned face. I said to him, "Is everything okay?" He looked at me for a moment, then nodded his head. Something about this immediately felt off. I climbed out of my tent and stood up. Asking what he was doing out, he responded by saying he was having trouble sleeping and just came out for some fresh air. But while he was talking, I looked down at his backpack. Sticking out the top was the back end of a handgun. I felt my face turn white as I looked back at Andrew and tried my best to hide my reaction. But he already knew what I saw. We stared at each other for a strange few seconds before he turned and went back inside his tent, not saying another word. I never seen him act like this before, and his face gave away that he was guilty of something. It was already strange that he never told me that he was bringing a gun, but the way he was acting just made it seem even more unsettling. I stayed up for the rest of the night. I was sitting on the ground outside the tents and waiting for the sun to come up, and when it did, I packed everything up and left. After that day, Andrew never contacted me, which I guess proves that something was going on that night. I don't know for sure what would have happened or why it would have happened, but I know that I was lucky to get out of there before finding out. I owned an RV that I would use all the time as a camper in the woods behind my house. It was a piece of junk, but I would only drive it out a couple of miles, then park it and hang out for a few days. So it didn't need to be anything special. Around 4 years ago I took this RV out into the woods for a normal weekend of camping. I drove out on a dirt road for about a mile, then I pulled off into a small spot between all the trees and set up camp. I made a small fire and brought out chairs, then sat back and had some drinks. I'd take friends out with me a lot, but they weren't able to spend several days away, so this was just some time I was spending by myself. As night started to come in, I put some more fuel on the fire pit. Just after the sun had gone down, I heard something moving around outside. It didn't sound like any wildlife. It sounded more like a person walking somewhere out in the trees. I looked out in that direction but didn't see anything. This went on for about 20 minutes, hearing what sounded like someone walking around my camp. I put out the fire and went inside the RV, locking it up for the night, and checking out the windows over the next hour, but still never seen anything from all the times I came out into the woods. I never once had someone come across my camp, so this was not a normal occurrence. And also knowing that they were wandering around in the dark without a flashlight was even less normal. I double checked the locks before going to bed, and thankfully I got a good night's sleep. In the morning I got up and made coffee, ate breakfast and spent a couple of hours in the RV before going outside. I wanted to take a hike around, but I wasn't too comfortable with leaving my RV there knowing that someone else was out there, so instead I went for a short walk. I went out where I heard the person from last night, looking for any shoe prints to confirm that it was actually a person, but from my quick search I didn't find anything helpful. I don't know if it made me more or less uneasy, but when I got back to the RV I brought out my handgun and strapped it to my waist, just to be safe. When it was night again, I started up the fire pit and tried to take my mind off things. I sat outside for a while, I want to say probably an hour, and was relieved not to have heard anyone. I had a beer and listened to the calming sounds of the woods at night until I got sleepy. I stood up and went to put out the fire when I saw a figure in the corner of my eye. My head quickly shifted to look at them. They were standing between the trees maybe 25 feet away, glowing in the faint light of the fire pit, and just watching me. Only a moment passed before they turned and walked away, leaving the light. I was really creeped out, and not hearing any more footsteps or movement only made me more paranoid about where they could be. I picked up everything I had outside and put it in the RV, then put out the fire and locked myself inside again. I was even thinking about fully packing up and heading home in the morning, because it just wasn't going to be a nice time anymore. Whoever was out there had now come to my RV twice, and neither time did they say anything or introduce themselves. I stayed on watch for a couple of hours, checking the windows multiple times and listening intently. It was during the third hour, while I was nodding off in my chair, that I heard footsteps approaching the RV. They were walking quickly, going right up to the door. I stayed quiet, clutching my pistol and hoping for them not to do anything. There was a few odd seconds of them not making a sound, but just standing on the other side of the door. Then they slowly walked around the RV, then quickly ran away. I stayed awake until the sun came up, and as soon as it was clear enough to drive, I got the RV ready and drove home. Whoever was out there had to have some sick plans for them to be coming up to my RV like that in the middle of the night. And I knew that if I stayed, it would likely have ended up really bad for one of us, and I wasn't going to take that chance for it to be me. I've never been much of an outdoor person, but the summer after my second year in college, one of my roommates convinced me to go tent camping with him. It was only over the weekend and I wasn't doing anything anyway, so I said I'd go with him. For the sake of privacy, I call him Jake. Now Jake would go all out. He had a 2014 Jeep Wrangler, the entire back seat filled almost completely with different camping gear. He didn't like to reserve spots at actual campsites, but instead find his own spots, which he said was more fun. We drove up into the Rocky Mountains a while until we found a break in the trees with enough space to fit the Jeep. We drove off-road between trees until we pointed out a good spot. We set up a fire pit, chairs and the tent we'd be staying in for the night. It was already around 7 p.m. and the sun was starting to set. Jake went to the car and pulled out a bag of hot dogs for us to cook over the fire. Real original, I know, but it was an easy meal, plus Jake wanted to give me a true camping experience, seeing that it was my first time. He even brought stuff for s'mores, although we never got that far. As we were cooking the hot dogs, this extremely loud female screaming came maybe 300 or 400 feet away. I go down through the trees. I look up and saw Jake's head turned around behind him, towards the direction of the screams. At first, there wasn't any words we could make out, but there was a help, a please, and a no. All of them sounded more desperate than the last. Then the loudest, most terrifying scream was abruptly cut off mid-scream. Jake looked back at my direction. The look on his face was pure horror. As far as we knew, the closest man-made structure was the road, and even that was far away. No one should have been out here. Whatever it was we just heard, it didn't even matter. We knew we needed to leave as fast as possible. We started quickly throwing things in the back of the Jeep. We shoved the still fully made tent inside as we closed the door. I tried calling 911 as we started driving back on the road. I had practically no service out there, but somehow still managed to get on the line with an operator. I did my best to explain what we heard, and they said that they will send a trooper out as soon as possible. It took us twice as long to get back to the road, just because this time we couldn't see anything. Finally, we saw the pavement and stopped for a second. We didn't know if we should wait for the cops or not. Then when we saw a figure walking out from the trees in front of us, he was wearing jeans with an all-black sweatshirt, the hood covering his face. He was dragging something behind him in a heavy sheet or some kind of bag. His head was down, laying almost limp as he walked. He looked over in our direction when blue and red police lights revealed themselves down the road. The man turned his head and started sprinting back into the forest, letting go of the bag. The police saw this and started chasing after him. The bag that he was dragging turned out to contain the remains of a 34-year-old woman. We don't know to this day if the man was ever caught.